Something big is coming. With the power to shape your financial future, the presidential election is more than just a political event. It's an economic earthquake waiting to happen. And the question is, will the next president stabilize the dollar or send it into a nosedive? How will your savings, investments, and everyday finances survive the storm? Today, we're uncovering the deep, often unseen impacts of presidential elections on your wealth. And let me tell you right now, it's not what you think. From shocking historical patterns to the critical moves you must make now, this video will reveal what happens to your dollar when the presidency changes hands. Buckle up because the stakes have never been higher. And in this video, we're going to discuss the major economic factors that affect you and your dollar, your bottom line, and historically how Democrats and Republicans both steal money out of your pocket and also make you richer. But before we get into it, my name's Nolan Matthias, and if you want the truth about money and finances, this is the place for you. So if at the end of the video you found it useful, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button so more people like you can see this video. Now, before we get started and get into the actual content of this video, I want to ask you a question, and preferably you'll answer it before you watch the video. Who do you think is the better option for your dollar? Who do you think is going to make you richer? Who do you think is going to make you poorer? Is it going to be Biden or is it going to be Harris? Tell me in the comments section below. I'm really curious to see what you think before you see the actual data. Okay, so in this video, what I wanted to do was I wanted to break down the economic track record, so to speak, of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Because obviously, when it comes to who you're going to choose for president, a large part of the reason why people choose to vote for one party or the other is how they feel it is going to affect them personally, especially when it comes to their finances. And this has never been truer than this election cycle after we are coming out of the pandemic and seeing inflation numbers that have, well, been seen before, but in a lot of cases have never been seen before by a lot of millennials. And we're seeing things happening in the employment market that are just abnormal. And then add in other factors like the national debt and everything else, and the rhetoric is crazy. But here's the question. What does it really mean to have a Democratic president versus a Republican president? And who is actually better for your personal bottom line? So what I did is I broke this out into 7 factors to look at. The first is GDP growth by various presidents in the past. The second is income growth. The third is unemployment. The fourth is stock market returns, so the amount of returns you're getting if you're investing. And then the fifth is inflation. Then I go a little bit into tax rates and budget deficits to create a complete picture of what happens when the president changes. Now, I think it's important to note that when it comes to politics, Republicans and Democrats have very different policies. Although from a capitalism perspective, they aren't that far apart. Republicans tend to advocate for lower taxes and less regulation. And these are often seen as more favorable for businesses and market performance. And of course, if businesses are doing well, then individuals should be doing well, right? Well, that isn't always the case. Now, Democrats focus on social programs and regulatory measures, and a lot of times these are seen as things that hamper business growth. So from a high-level overview, what you would expect is that Republicans are typically going to be better for the economy and Democrats are going to be worse for the economy. But that isn't actually how it usually plays out. And I think the numbers that are going to come up in the next little bit here are going to be surprising. So let's start first by taking a look at GDP growth. So what I did here is I went back 25 years for pretty much all of this data, starting with the Reagan administration. Now, this is the beginning of what I would consider modern economic times. This is when a lot of the innovation in things like technology, the iPhone, all of that stuff, the dot-com bubble, that's when all of this really started. And of course, it started with Reaganomics, which many people argue to be one of the most successful economic times in history. But was it really one of the most successful economic times in history? Well, let me show you what the data looks like. So if we take a look at average GDP growth by president, it becomes clear that the Reagan era, the Bush era, and the Clinton era were among the best times from a growth perspective for the economy. Now, as you can see here, Joe Biden has some pretty big numbers as well, but this can largely be attributed to the fact that the pandemic happened. And obviously, as we came out of the pandemic, and we had the significant printing of money, which led to a greater money supply and inflation, that this number is artificially enhanced. And what you'll notice is that throughout the conversation here, there are many periods of time where the actual economic data was either artificially enhanced by some sort of economic event or something that was outside of the norm of what would typically happen. And I think it's important to point out here that there are three major economic circumstances that play a major role in everything that goes on with respect to the economy in all of this data. The first is the dot-com bubble bust in the late 90s and early 2000s. The second is the financial crisis in 2008. And the third is, of course, the pandemic. And when you take a look at modern history, pretty much every president going back to Clinton has been affected in some way, shape, or form by one of these three economic crises or the run-ups in the stock market like the dot-com bubble. But what's interesting to note, and you'll see this throughout the video, is that it really doesn't come down to the individual presidents. What is more impactful when it comes to the economy is the makeup of the government as a whole. Now, what it means when there's a unified Republican makeup or a unified Democrat makeup is that the president comes from the same party that controls both houses in Congress. And when you have a divided government makeup, that means that the House or the Senate or both are controlled by the president's opposing party. And what you'll start to notice here is a theme: what happens when there is a divided government makeup. And when you look at it from a GDP perspective, what you can see clearly is that when you have a Democratic president that doesn't have control over the House and the Senate, well, that leads to a scenario where typically GDP growth is higher. Now, to put this in perspective, when we have a divided Republican president and we have a divided Democratic president, for the purposes of this sample, both of these scenarios played out for exactly 14 years. So the numbers are very much apples to apples. Now, when we move into income growth, this is obviously the one piece that has the biggest impact, or arguably the biggest impact, on your personal bottom line. And when we look at the impact on income growth by president, you can see that the two leading presidents were Barack Obama and Ronald Reagan. Now, this graph doesn't really paint a great picture because it's hard to say just by looking at it which party is actually better for income growth, because both parties have presidents that were bad for income growth and both parties have presidents that were good for income growth. So if instead we take a look at it from a unified versus a divided government makeup, what you can see is that the best scenario for the American people is when there is a Democratic president in a divided government. And the argument for this is really quite simple. Democratic presidents put an emphasis on Social Security and things like that, which helps bring up the incomes of the poor, while they have the checks and balances in place from Republicans to make sure that there isn't a significant amount of overspending. Now, where there's been unified Republican government makeups, we can see that the numbers are dismal. When Republicans control both the presidency and Congress, there tends to be no income growth. Now, there might be growth for businesses due to lower taxes and things like that, but that rarely trickles down to the common man. And in the same vein, the second best option from an income growth perspective is to have a Republican president who doesn't also control all of Congress. So regardless of which way you put this, the best thing from an income growth perspective is to have a president that has to play nice with the other party because they control at least the House or the Senate. Now, moving into chapter 3, which is unemployment, you can see again that this one is really interesting because every single Democratic president has had a positive effect on unemployment. Now, this graph is a little bit different because this shows the change in unemployment. And in the cases of Clinton, Obama, and Biden, the unemployment rates have come down. And under Bush Sr., Bush Jr., and Donald Trump, the unemployment rate has increased. Now, Donald Trump's numbers are probably a little bit out of whack here because obviously he resided over the pandemic, which led to significant amounts of unemployment. But regardless, what you can see here is that Democrats definitely have a better record when it comes to you being able to keep your job. But, and there's a big but here, only when they don't control the entirety of Congress. And interestingly enough, when there is a Republican president who doesn't control Congress, the numbers get even better. So even though you can look at the individual track records of different presidents, what it really comes down to is the makeup of the government as a whole. Are you starting to see a theme here? And then we get into the stock market because, of course, many Republicans believe that the stock market performs better when a Republican is in power, and many Democrats believe that the stock market performs better when a Democrat is in power. And the reality is it's anybody's guess. Bill Clinton obviously resided over some of the biggest market returns in history. Barack Obama, who was aided by the financial crash that happened right before he took power, also resided over pretty significant increases in the stock market, but this is the total stock market returns during specific presidencies. And it doesn't really give Trump a fair shake, and it doesn't really give Bush Sr. a fair shake because obviously Clinton and Obama had double the amount of time in office in order to have these impacts. So instead, what we need to look at is the average annual returns. Now, the numbers play out fairly similarly, although they don't look as bad as the previous graph. And what you can see clearly is that Bill Clinton and Obama both resided over some of the best annual returns in history. But with the exception of George W. Bush, who dealt with the 47% decline in the S&P 500 in 2007, every single president has had positive stock returns. Now, there's an argument to be made that the president actually doesn't have any effect over the stock market whatsoever. But the important thing to note here is that regardless of who the president was, there was times of prosperity and times of investment growth. And if you take out that 1 year in George W. Bush's presidency, well, guess what? His stock market returns were positive as well. And then when we take a look at the S&P 500 average annual returns by government makeup, you can see that again, things seem to almost always be better when there's a Democratic president who is being checked and balanced by a Republican Senate or House. It's that simple. But ironically, the stock market seems to perform better when there's a Democratic president. Now, I need to stop here for a second and make it clear because there's going to be many people watching this video who go, oh, Nolan's skewing the data. He's a Democrat by nature. And that's not true. I'm an economist. I'm fiscally conservative. So these numbers don't act in the way that I would expect them to. But unfortunately, the data is the data. And what this shows is that Republicans aren't really as good for the economy as many people expect. But I'm also inclined to make the argument that people put too much emphasis on the president's power when it comes to the markets and the economy as a whole for that matter. Now, next, we'll look at inflation. The majority of the time, it seems as though the Democrats have a better track record when it comes to inflation. Now, Joe Biden obviously presided over the recovery from the pandemic, and I have to be clear here that inflation in the US wasn't just a US problem, this was a worldwide problem. So to say that Joe Biden is responsible for the 5.6% inflation rate is absolutely ridiculous because he literally had zero control over the inflation rate. He didn't have control over ships getting stuck in the Suez Canal. He didn't have control over China returning to normal business operations and supplying the world's goods. And he definitely didn't have control over whether or not the pandemic happened because he wasn't even in power when the pandemic happened. But when we take a look at the average inflation by government makeup, this chart seems to imply that a unified democratic government is the best option. But that's not really the case because there was only 4 years where there was a unified democratic government in this sample size. And there were 7 years where there was a unified Republican government. Now, I might argue that the lower inflation numbers under the unified Republican government are actually correlated. But when you look at the breakup between a divided government, again, the Democratic president with Republicans keeping checks and balances in place seems to be a better option than a Republican president with a Democratic House or Senate. But again, I have to emphasize the fact that I think we're putting a little bit too much emphasis on the power of the president to control things like inflation. Now, this leads us into a whole conversation about how taxes affect things and how Republicans are better for taxes and deficits and how Democrats are worse for deficits. And the numbers here again might surprise you because when we look at the tax record, what you can see is that going back to the Reagan administration, we pretty much haven't seen any substantial changes to the individual tax rates. So over the last 25 years, if you were to consider taxes as a reason for voting for either a Republican or a Democrat, what you would probably find is it makes almost zero difference, especially when you consider the fact that incomes have almost always gone up and that even in times where taxes have risen slightly, the net benefit to the individual has outweighed those greater tax rates. So then we have to look at the US federal deficit by president. And this one's really interesting because the only president in the last 25 years who has actually had a surplus, who's actually reduced the federal deficit substantially, is Bill Clinton. And President Obama, in the same vein, actually did a lot to reduce the deficit as well. Now, for the majority of President Obama's term, he also had to deal with a Republican-controlled House or Senate, so he had some checks and balances in place. But the irony is, as Trump touts his business record and his financial savvy, what you can see is that even early in his presidency, before the pandemic hit, budget deficits were increasing. Now, ironically, as much as you would expect a Republican president to encourage the deficit to be lower, Trump's business record doesn't exactly exude confidence in the fact that he isn't going to take on debt, because the majority of his wealth was made by borrowing money, and he lost the majority of his wealth as well prior to becoming a TV star because of his debt burdens. So, for a guy like Trump to run up the debt wouldn't necessarily be out of character. But the argument that Republicans are better for debt and they're better fiscally just doesn't hold true, especially when you look at the numbers. And don't shoot the messenger here. This is just the data. I'm not taking the side of Republicans, and I'm definitely not taking the side of Democrats. Because I think the reality here is that the most important thing is that the US government has checks and balances, and that the president is never in control of the Congress as well. And of course, I say that the president's never in control of Congress as well. What I really mean is that the president's party is never also in control of Congress as well. Because the times where the US experiences the most economic prosperity is when there's a balance of power. And then last but not least, before I talk about the problems with this sort of analysis, let's talk about what happens with the US dollar. Because again, this is often something that comes up leading up to elections. Republicans will say they're better for the dollar, Democrats will say they're better for the dollar. But the reality here is that neither party actually is better for the dollar, especially in the first 250 days after a presidency. And when we talk about 250 days here, we're talking about 250 trading days or an entire year. And in the first year of Donald Trump's presidency, the dollar was down. In the first year after Barack Obama was reelected, the dollar was down. In the first year after he was originally elected, the dollar was down. The dollar was up quite substantially after the reelection of George W. Bush, but when he was originally elected, it was down as well. And of course, then there was the Bill Clinton era, where pretty much everything in the economy seemed to be firing on all cylinders for his entire 8 years. And when George H.W. Bush took control, well, the dollar was up about 4.81%. But what all this data shows is that there's literally no correlation between the president's party and the effects on the dollar in the first year of their presidency. So let's talk quickly before I get into what you should be doing about the problems with this type of analysis. And what I mean by the problems with this type of analysis is anytime a guy like me stands on YouTube and pores over these numbers, anytime a Fox commentator tells you that one of the presidents is better for the economy or worse, and anytime a CNN commentator says the exact same thing. It is very hard to distinguish the actual role that a president plays on the economy. And there are several factors to this. The first, it's really hard to factor in the previous party's spillover. So in other words, what decisions did Trump make that benefited Biden? And prior to that, what decisions did President Obama make that benefited Trump? Because the amount of time, the lag between a decision being made in an economy and when it actually takes effect could be 10 years, could be 20 years, could be 30 years. So attributing a president's economic success solely to that person is not just hard to do, it is pretty much impossible to do. Then in addition to that, a president's economic record doesn't account for economic outliers. Things like the pandemic, which both hurt President Trump from the perspective of the amount of debt that he ran up, because obviously most of that debt was created in the first year of the pandemic. And let's be clear here, President Trump had no other option than to allow that debt to run up. It was needed in order to prevent the economy from completely imploding. But then President Biden had to deal with the fact that there was all that debt, all that money printing, and that made his inflation numbers look really, really bad. And same thing for President Obama. Without the financial crisis, is his record really as good as it seems to be? And then not only that, the party's positions on various different things tend to change over time. Obviously, the Republicans have become a lot more right-leaning as the Democrats have become a lot more left-leaning. And the policies of Trump and Biden probably aren't very similar to those of Reagan and Clinton. And then last but not least, all of these sort of assessments, all of these sort of analysis, they overestimate just how much of an impact a president actually has. They give far more credit than credit is due when things are going good, and they apply far too much blame for things that are quite often outside of the president's control. But one thing through all of this analysis is clear. There's one thing that benefits the United States people the most, and that is making sure that the president and his party doesn't at the same time control both houses of Congress. It's as simple as that. The one thing that makes American politics awful by many accounts, which is the two-party system, is also the thing that makes the US government so effective. It's the fact that there are two parties, the country is almost equally divided, and there are often checks and balances in place so that a president can't go ahead and run amok. And regardless of who wins this next election, whether it's Harris or Trump, the tragedy would be either of their parties also having complete control of the Senate and the House. Because it's the negotiation and the need to work together that comes from both parties having at least some control that provides the best economic scenario for the American people. And the numbers and the data here simply do not lie. I cannot emphasize enough that it really doesn't matter who the president is. What matters is that there's a balance of power. So what can you do as we lead up to this next election? Well, first is vote your conscience. Vote for the party whose values most align with yours, and consider it a win if the presidency and Congress aren't all controlled by the same party. And then instead of thinking that one of these two options is going to be better for your personal bottom line, take complete ownership over your personal finances. Because regardless of which president or which party is in power, you can make significant amounts of money as long as you are willing to do the things to improve your own personal situation. The president is not the person who's making you poor. The president is not the person who's making you make less money. You are the person who is putting yourself in both of those scenarios. And then last but not least, don't watch the news. Don't listen to the pundits on YouTube and the pundits on Fox and CNN and take their bullshit for anything other than what it's worth, which is nothing. Focus on voting for the party that you think will give you the best edge. And if they don't win, they don't win. It really doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to your personal finances, politics are nothing more than a distraction. Regardless of what rules come into place, what laws are passed, the wealthiest Americans will find ways to deal with those situations. For the most part, it's not going to change your financial situation. It might just change how you operate from a tax perspective. And hopefully, whichever nominee wins, we don't find ourselves in the next Great Depression because they go to war or do something crazy. Oh, and by the way, if you want to see what always happens before a depression, and by the way, some of those things are happening right now, make sure you check out this video right here.